Despite how it may appear, this is not a story about death. This is a story about free will. The weeks following the accident passed in a blur. I couldn't sleep and I ended up with a prescription for some chemical aid, which succeeded in numbing my mind and blunting the edge of reality. For days I didn't bathe and existed in a fog interrupted by tasteless meals and even more tasteless daytime TV. And the cloak was put in the closet, crammed into the back by the leftover Christmas wrapping paper and linens, where it sat, forgotten. After a month in a purgatory of grief and shock, I finally emerged and rejoined the living. Work resumed and I cautiously started going out with friends, and life moved on. For a time. Although my mind never strayed too far from what I'd witnessed that day on the street, I was processing it, and slowly but surely I was coming to peace. It was about 12 weeks later that all my progress came to a grinding, violent halt. Again, it was a beautiful sunny day, birds chirping and not a single cloud in the sky. As I sipped my coffee on my patio, I saw that the apartment groundskeeper was doing some mowing. I sat and I watched him work, idly thinking about my own tasks for the day ahead of me. I reached for my coffee, savoring the morning, when my left hand suddenly went numb. I felt like it had been dipped into ice water, pins and needles dancing across my flesh. I stood up suddenly, knocking into my patio table in haste, looking for the source of the chill. At that moment, I saw the groundskeeper from the corner of my eye. Pushing the mower between one step and the next, he suddenly went stiff, a marionette with all his strings pulled taut. My hand forgotten, I turned just in time to see him collapse in the grass. The bird song stopped, along with everything else. In slow motion, I watched blades of grass float to the ground, and my discarded coffee cup seemed to be suspended in the air. Like a wave crashing, time caught up suddenly, the cacophony of noise from the nearby street punctuated by the smash of the mug on the patio floor. In the span of a heartbeat, I was outside and beside the collapsed man. A neighbor had also seen him fall and I could hear him on the phone with an emergency dispatch. But one look at the groundskeeper and I knew it was too late. So, once more, I found myself holding the hand of a man struggling through his last moments of life. He clutched at his chest, frantically trying to draw a breath, while I supplicated, knees in grass clippings praying for his peace. He gripped my hand tighter, eyes metronome ticking between mine and the ring on his left hand. The truth of the situation seemed to settle in. He tried desperately to tell me something. It came out as a near whisper, impossible to decipher. Shh. I'll tell her you love her, but she already knows. From the wedding band on his finger, I guessed that was what he was trying to say. Tears pooled in his eyes, but he nodded, the pleading look replaced by something closer to acceptance. Focus on your love. She can feel it. I took a deep breath, my own tears choking my voice. My words seemed to be lulling him through, and a faint smile had appeared on his lips. Just think of all the stories you'll have to tell her when you see each other again. His eyes closed slowly, like a setting sun, and his chest stilled. while my hand, still clasped in his, gave another flare of icy cold. He was gone. Later, after the paramedics had been and went, and the crowd of neighbors had dispersed like carrion crows called home, I was again alone in my apartment. Although my hand had returned to normal temperature, a hot shower was needed. Like after the first accident, I was numb. I guess death is cold. As the scalding water rained down on me, I couldn't stop my mind from going over the events of the 2 deaths I'd now borne witness to. The scenes looping, replaying in tandem, reflecting the fragility of life. I was not okay. I was deeply affected by what I had been involved in. But I also knew that, if given a do-over, I would make the same choices again. To be there for those last moments so that they wouldn't be alone. When I finally stepped from the tub, the bathroom was thick with fog, the mirror obscured by film. I blindly reached for a towel, but my hand settled on an unfamiliar fabric hanging from the rack. The inky, black cloak was no longer tucked away in the closet. After witnessing the second man's passing, I was understandably checked out. Laughter was a memory, happiness a whispered rumor. I was scared to go outside, lest I be in the wrong place at the wrong time again. Although, I was honored to have been able to hopefully bring a modicum of comfort to the men I'd seen pass. My mental state was suffering. I began getting headaches, ice picks driven deep behind my eyes. The only cure being isolation in a dark, silent room. My friends, despite my protests, were determined not to let me waste away behind closed doors. They brought care packages, kept me updated on the lives of mutual acquaintances, and even drove me to doctor's appointments. While I took a sabbatical from work and tried to find relief from my headaches, I was hounded constantly by the thought of that black hooded cloak. I hadn't moved it from the towel rack in the bathroom. The thought of even touching it was too much for me, especially in my admittedly fragile state. One Sunday, I awoke, inexplicably determined to get some fresh air into my lungs. So, I ventured out to the beach near my house. Overwhelmed by the prospect of crowds, I ensured I arrived early and claimed a spot in the shade under a beautiful willow tree. I nestled into my blanket, closed my eyes, and let the sound of the gently lapping waves drift over me. It was the most peaceful I'd felt since everything had happened. I don't know how long I lay there, in the magical place between sleep and wakefulness, blessedly free from headaches. When I finally fully woke, the sun was high in the sky, and although my patch of shade had shrunk, I could feel the beginnings of a sunburn. My left hand tingled with a chill. I never understood the saying, "My blood ran cold," until that moment. I knew, without a doubt, that I was about to witness another death. My mind raced as I considered running. My self-preservation panicked at the thought that this was no longer something I could just chalk up to coincidence. But it was too late. A woman's voice, tentative at first, began calling for her child. "Harper? Harper, honey, come to Mommy." The woman's voice quickly became more frantic, and soon others had taken up the call as well. I stood up from my blanket, eyes pulled to the horizon where a small shape was barely discernible among the waves. I could have alerted somebody else, but I knew this was my task alone. Like the inevitability of death, I had begun to accept what was happening. I sprinted to the water and plunged in. thankful for my years spent swimming, as I quickly covered the distance to the child. By now, others had seen where I was heading and were attempted to catch up and help, but I was the first to arrive by a large margin, as I knew I would be. When I reached the little girl, I saw that she was small, no older than 8 or 9. Her long blonde hair streaming around her like a mermaid. Her blue eyes were open. As I reached for her, she slipped under the water. I dove down, her gaze locking with mine as I followed her towards the sandy bottom of the ocean. She had already gone still, no longer thrashing, her hands delicately floating in front of her in a graceful arc of a ballerina's pose. Now parallel and eye to eye, I took her small fingers in my numb left hand, and the air left her lungs in a final cloud of tiny, perfect bubbles. I could swear I heard her sigh. For a few heartbeats we swayed together, under the surface. The quiet calm, a private refuge from the chaos I knew was occurring above. When I finally broke the surface, bringing her up with me, a crowd of other swimmers was there to help pull her to shore. Although, it was too late. A few people attempted to resuscitate her on the beach. Seeing all I had needed to, and knowing there was nothing more I could do, I stumbled away to the tree, forgotten by the other rescuers and the hysterical mother, now weeping over her child's slight frame. I collapsed on my blanket, unable to move or form a cohesive thought. Slowly, with infinite tenderness, a warmth settled around me. Looking down at myself, I saw that the black cloak had been draped over my shoulders. I whirled around, desperate to see who had wrapped it around me, to finally identify the gift giver who had been my near constant cause of fear for the last few months. No one was there, and no footprints marred the sand behind me. With raised hair on the verge of a panic attack, I all but fled to my home, determined to check myself into a psychiatric facility or a church as soon as possible. At home, I hung the cloak up in the entryway, unaware as to why I hadn't left it behind. I was about to call a friend for help when I saw I had a voicemail on my phone. It was the doctor's office, asking me to come in to discuss the results of my recent MRI. I knew then, without having to hear the diagnosis, that it was something bad. The next day, the events at the beach were put aside while I attended a meeting at the hospital which brought sobering news. The cause of my headaches, although something I had tried to shrug off as inconsequential, was in fact an inoperable tumor. The prognosis stiffly delivered by an unflinching specialist, giving me an expiry date akin to that of a carton of milk. There was a lot of talk about keeping me comfortable, and about decisions I would need to make. But there is one decision that I must make before any others. When I arrived home, still in shock from the death sentence I was handed, a letter was waiting for me on my credenza. The beautiful calligraphy, written in the same hand as the original card accompanying the cloak, beckoned. The envelope addressed to me by name. With shaking fingers, I began to read. Death has never been the end, and as yours is approaching, you must decide. Will you wear the cloak? The choice, as always, is yours. So, here I sit, my laptop the only illumination in my room, the cloak draped across my bed. I have a decision to make.